everyone. So if you want access to investment opportunities you can't get access to yourself, don't hesitate to reach out to me on the email below. And today is a very interesting video because, as many of you might have known, our monthly readership across platforms has now reached over 8 million people. But it's taken a lot of work to get here. So what are the 10 biggest mistakes that I feel I personally made on this journey? So number one was speculating when I was very young. In other words, from the age of 18 to 21, as I've mentioned on a few answers before online, I was sensible enough to start investing at a young age, which obviously makes a hell of a lot of sense, right? But where I was foolish was, I was more like a speculator and not an investor. So of course it wasn't a big deal because I was very young when I made those mistakes, but obviously I should have actually been investing as opposed to speculating based on emotion. Number two is not adapting soon enough. Now, what do I mean by that? The last 10 or 15 years have been an absolutely extraordinary time in the world. For the first time, I think really we've moved from, or we're in the process of moving from, an industrial age to a digital age. I simply did not adapt quick enough to that. Then number three, which is linked to number two, I listened too much to older people in my industry. Now, a lot of those older people were given very antiquated advice, things like business is best done face-to-face, or many different things which used to be applicable but aren't applicable now. And it makes me realize that actually when people come into a new industry, there's always those people, those 10 or 20% of people who adapt really well. And they are really worth their weight in gold because they've got both experience and they've adapted to the industry norms, or should I say, the new ways of doing business. Certainly not industry norms. I'm going to cover that very soon. The analogy I would make is this. We've all watched, say, managers in sport. Like if you watch football, there's certain managers who become dinosaurs, like Arsene Wenger when he was at Arsenal, even Mourinho has gone down a lot. We can always think in business as well, people who did really well in the 80s and 90s who no longer do well. So there's always those percentage of people, right, in business and sport, in any domain, who adapt to the times. It was a huge mistake just to trust what older people were telling me, because many of those older people, they were using techniques that worked in the 70s, 80s, 90s, even maybe the early to mid 2000s, but simply don't work in this day and age. Also, I think another mistake I made was not breaking industry norms quick enough. What I mean by that is, as I've said in a few answers or a few videos even before, norms stand for normal. Now, normal behavior will lead to normal results, whereas extraordinary behavior will lead to extraordinary results. In other words, if you want to just do or get average results, you just do what everyone else is doing. But by definition, unless you just hope to outwork somebody or outsmart somebody, of course you're not going to be inside the top 1 or 2% in your industry if you just follow what everybody else is doing, right? You're either going to fail, you're going to get slightly above average results, slightly below average. But if you don't actually break norms, you're not going to be successful. And almost all of the best decisions I've made, and most profitable decisions, has been doing things that have completely broken all kinds of industry norms. For example, I think I mentioned on a few videos ago that the best person I've hired in the last year or two came from a freelancer website, not from a recruiter. And I don't think any of my other competitors do that. So if I would have done that sooner, consistently broken industry norms, don't get me wrong, not all of the ideas would have worked, but a percentage of them will work. And the benefit of breaking industry norms is, because by definition most people aren't trying it, you've got the advantage then. It's a bit like these days, it's not breaking industry norms to try to get clients on LinkedIn, but 10 years ago it was. And guess what? 10 years ago it was more profitable. YouTube's another example, right? Now it's quite normal to get people, clients and whatever from YouTube, but the people who tried when it wasn't normal, they had the first mover advantage, right? So it's always good to try things whenever other people are not doing it. Also, another thing is, I think, spending too much time with toxic people, right? I didn't know they were toxic at the time, but I think it's like a lot of us, right? I think when you're a bit younger, especially when you're just out of university, you don't always know which people are actually toxic people, which people are the kind of people you want to hang around with. So I think it's always a bad thing to spend time with toxic people. Now I'm very selective about who I spend time with. Also, I would say not reading enough after university. I did read and listen to podcasts and other things after university, but I think in the first 5 years especially, it would have been incredibly beneficial to actually read even more than at university. But I think what happened was, of course, I had a full-time job. I was tired after coming home from work, and I thought, well, I didn't have any time. But everyone has time, right? We can all make time. So in the last few years, even though I probably have less time, I'm reading more and more and more. And that really helps, because the more you read, the more ideas you have. The more ideas you have, the more you can implement. The more you implement, the more a small percentage of your ideas will actually, be successful. Another thing I would say is languages. Now, if I could go back in time when I was actually at school, the one class I would have actually paid more attention to would have been the languages class, European languages. I did learn reasonable Chinese when I was living in China, and I have learned some other non-European languages. But I think learning Spanish or French or German to a very high standard would have been good for my business. And also translating content. So it's only in the last year that I've started translating content into other languages. But now you can do that quite cheaply online, or indeed if you've got people working in your organization who can translate your content, you can do it for other people. So I think I should have done that sooner. Also, not moving fast enough with certain things. Now, what do I mean by that? When I started out, say in the online world, what I would often do is I would dip my toes in. I would say, I'm going to put in $50 into the Facebook ad, or I'm going to do $100 here, or whatever. Being much more aggressive much sooner, once I started to see a good return on investment, would have been more sensible than, I think, gradually coming up. Another thing I would say is a key commonality from all of these things is time. Probably the most important resource in the world is time, because it's linked to our finances, it's linked to our health. We all only have 24 hours in a day. So what does that mean? Online, we can't scale. By definition, you can't scale by meeting people face to face, right? We only have 24 hours in a day. But the same when it comes to what I said about toxic people before. There's only so many hours in a day, and you can't kind of delete that time. Same with the other things like reading. Using time effectively is even more important than using money effectively, because it's indirectly linked to money, your mental health, your physical health. So using time efficiently is important. But often what happens is people start to realize that when they get to their late 20s, 30s, 40s. When they're coming out of university, they think, well, they've got all the time in the world, right? And I thought very similar. But not using time most effectively was a huge mistake. And also, as a final thing, I would say not thinking big enough. In other words, when I started out in the online world, after doing my business even before I was publicly available on the internet, I wouldn't have even guessed that I could have got 1 million views for my content globally. Never mind 8.5 million, which it is standing today. But the big mistake I've made in the past is not always thinking big enough, because a lot of people in society try to bring people down, and it's natural, right? You don't want to think too big, because a lot of people will try to bring you down. They'll think it sounds boastful, or it sounds greedy, or whatever. But the reality is, often you get what you aim for. It's not just in finance, right? It's in many areas. For example, if you say, I'm going to lose 20 kilos of weight, it's more likely you're going to achieve that if you're very confident about it and you just say it. I am losing weight, I am going to lose 20 kilos, than just saying, I'm going to lose about 5 kilos. And the same when it comes to business, when it comes to lifestyle. I think being more, more ambitious, as long as it's realistic, on the upper side of realistic is the key. In other words, if you think, as an example, that you can make between 100 and 200,000 next year, if you add 10 or 20% to that, so 220,000, you're more likely to achieve it. If you try to say 2 million, obviously in that situation, you're probably not going to achieve it, because it's so far away from your your benchmarks. But if you think is realistic, do 100 to 200,000. Just going 10% higher, 20% higher, and then once you achieve that, going much higher than that. I wish I would have done that sooner. In other words, actually be more aggressive, or should we say more ambitious with some of the goals, because ultimately we only get often what we're willing to put in. We only get what we're aiming for. Because if you have the target too low, often you just achieve that target, and then you spend the rest of the month not being as proactive as you need to be.